The wind was the first thing you knew about this land, and the last thing you'd forget. It was a sculptor of badlands and a thief of words, a constant, whining presence that scoured the plains of West Texas until the very soul of the earth felt raw and exposed. It carried the scent of dust, drought, and distance, a trinity of hardship that defined life here in the 1870s. The sky, on a good day, was a merciless, bleached-out blue. Today, it was the color of a fresh bruise, a low-slung ceiling of gray that promised a misery it was in no hurry to deliver. Underneath it, the prairie grass was the color of old bones, brittle and broken. It crunched under a horse's hoof with a sound like dying whispers. Red dust, fine as flour, coated everything. The sparse, thorny mesquite, the hides of the longhorn cattle, the lines etched around a man's eyes. It was a land that demanded resilience and offered little in return but a wide, lonely horizon. To survive here was to be in a constant, silent battle with God's harder intentions. Elijah was a man carved from this very landscape. At 42, he was tall and broad in the shoulder, but lean in a way that spoke of work, not want. The sun had tanned his skin to the color of worn leather and bleached the brown of his hair with streaks of sun-bleached gold at the temples. His eyes were the faded blue of a distant sky, and they held the quiet, watchful stillness of a man long accustomed to his own company. They had once held a different light, a warmth that mirrored a wife's smile and the bright spark of a young son's laughter. But that was before the fever. The fever had swept through their small settlement 4 years ago like a phantom fire, unseen but deadly, leaving silence and freshly turned earth in its wake. It took his Sarah, the woman whose hands had softened the hard edges of his world. And it took little Jacob, whose future had been the only map Elijah had ever cared to read. When the silence finally settled, Elijah found himself the sole inhabitant of a world built for three. The quiet in his small, sturdy cabin was no longer peaceful. It was a living thing, a weight that pressed down on him in the dark. He sold off half the herd, keeping just enough to work himself to exhaustion from sunup to sundown. The only remedy he knew for a pain that had no name. His ranch, sprawling and isolated, became his fortress and his prison, a kingdom of one, ruled by memory and routine. This morning, the world had turned on its head. A freak spring snow had descended upon the plains. It wasn't the soft, blanketing snow of a proper winter, but a mean, biting flurry, driven sideways by the relentless wind. The flakes were small and hard, stinging his exposed skin as he rode toward the fledgling town of Redemption's Folly for supplies. The snow didn't settle so much as it mingled with the red dust, creating a strange, pinkish slush that clung to the hooves of his steady gelding. Samson, it was a perverse kind of weather, unnatural and unsettling. Another reminder that this land was beholden to no man's expectations. It was on the rutted track that passed for a road, a few miles from the edge of town, that he saw them. At first, they were just a smudge against the bleak landscape, a dark shape huddled by a skeletal-looking cottonwood that offered no shelter at all. His first instinct, born of years of solitude and caution, was to steer Samson wide. Trouble came in all forms out here, and 2 women alone on a roadside in a storm was a form he'd never encountered. But as he drew closer, something in their posture, a profound and desperate stillness, stayed his hand. He reined Samson to a halt a dozen yards away, his hand resting near the butt of the Colt Peacemaker on his hip, a gesture so ingrained it was thoughtless. One woman was on her feet, standing ramrod straight against the wind, a thin shawl clutched around her shoulders. The other was sitting on a worn leather trunk, her head bowed as if in prayer or utter defeat. The standing one looked up as he approached, and Elijah felt an unexpected jolt. She was perhaps 30, with a face that might have been beautiful before exhaustion and sorrow had laid their claim to it. High cheekbones and a strong jaw gave her a look of innate dignity, but her eyes, a deep and turbulent gray, were hollowed out with weariness. Her dress was dark, simple, and worn thin, the dress of a widow. The younger one lifted her head, and if the first woman was a study in quiet endurance, this one was a flicker of defiant fire. She couldn't have been more than 22. Her hair, a rich chestnut brown, had escaped its pins and whipped around a face that was sharper, more angular than her companion's. Her green eyes, narrowed against the wind, and his sudden appearance held a spark of suspicion, of challenge. But beneath the sharp edges, Elijah saw the same bone-deep fatigue and a fragility she was trying desperately to hide. "Ma'am," Elijah said, his voice raspy from disuse. He tipped his hat, the brim heavy with wet snow. "You seem to be in a spot of trouble." The older woman, the widow, was the one who spoke. Her voice was low and steady, though he could see the effort it took to keep it from trembling. That would be an understatement. "Sir, our wagon broke an axle a mile back. The driver took his pay and left us here. Said he'd be back from town. That was yesterday morning." Elijah's jaw tightened. He knew the type. A freight driver who'd take the money and leave women stranded was the lowest sort of vermin. "He ain't coming back," he said, the words flat and certain. "Not in this. Storm's only getting worse. Town's a good 3 miles. You'll freeze before you make it halfway." The younger one pushed herself to her feet, her chin jutting out. "We'll manage." The older one placed a gentle hand on her arm. "Violet, please." She turned her gaze back to Elijah, a silent plea that was more powerful than any spoken word. We don't have any money for a room, not until we can find work. We were just hoping to get to town, to find some shelter from the storm." Her eyes drifted to the small bundle at her feet, and for the first time, Elijah realized they had nothing but the trunk and a single, pitiful-looking sack. They were destitute. He was a man who had walled off his heart, mortared the cracks with hard work and silence. The last thing he needed, the last thing he wanted, was the complication of 2 strange women. His life had a rhythm, a stark and lonely peace. They would shatter it. He should say no. He should tell them to start walking, wish them luck, and ride on. It was the sensible thing to do. It was the safe thing to do. But then his gaze fell on the older woman's hands, clenched tightly around her shawl. They were red and raw from the cold, and he saw them tremble. It wasn't just a shiver. It was a deep, uncontrollable tremor, the kind that comes when the body has burned through its last reserves of warmth and sustenance. He thought of Sarah, how her hands would get cold so easily. He remembered tucking them into his own to warm them by the fire. The memory was a ghost of a pain, sharp and unwelcome. He looked away, out at the endless, unforgiving plains. Leaving them here would be a death sentence, a slow one, but a sentence nonetheless. He had seen too much death. He couldn't bring himself to be an accomplice to another. He let out a long, slow breath, his resolve crumbling like a riverbank in a flood. "My ranch is closer than town," he heard himself say. "It ain't much, but it's warm and dry. You can stay there till the storm breaks." He paused, then added, "You can work for your keep. There's always chores to be done." He added the last part for his own benefit as much as theirs. This was a transaction, not charity. It made it feel less like he was letting the world, and all its messy emotions, back into his sealed-off life. The relief that washed over the widow's face was so profound it was almost painful to watch. The tension seemed to drain from her, leaving her swaying slightly on her feet. "Thank you, sir. God bless you. My name is Clara. This is my sister, Violet." Violet said nothing, but her sharp green eyes studied him, no longer with suspicion, but with a raw, searching intensity, as if she were trying to read the fine print of his soul. "Elijah," he said gruffly. "Get your things. Violet, you'll ride with me. Clara, you'll have to ride Samson behind the saddle. He's a gentle beast." The journey back was made in near silence, broken only by the howl of the wind and the creak of saddle leather. Elijah held the nervous, rigid form of Violet in front of him, her body radiating a chill that seemed to seep right through his thick coat. Behind him, he could feel the slight weight of Clara, her hands gripping the back of the saddle for balance. The presence of two women, their softness, their scent, a faint mix of lavender and hardship, was so alien in his world of sweat, leather, and solitude that it felt like a dream. When his cabin came into view, a dark, solid shape against the swirling white, it looked smaller, lonelier than ever. He helped them down, his hands briefly circling their waists. Clara was light as a bird, her body frail beneath the thin wool of her dress. Violet was firmer, wirier, and she pulled away the second her feet touched the ground. He pushed open the heavy plank door, and a wave of cold, still air washed over them. The fire had died down to sullen red embers in the stone hearth. He gestured them inside. "It's not much," he repeated, feeling a sudden, strange need to apologize for the starkness of his life. For the first time, the two women stepped into the home where Elijah had lived alone for 4 long years. The cabin was a single large room, meticulously clean but overwhelmingly masculine. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall. A rough-hewn table with a single chair stood in the center. A narrow bed, covered with a thick buffalo hide, was tucked into a corner. His saddle rested on a stand by the door, and the air smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and coffee. There were no curtains on the single window, no rug on the floor, no pictures on the walls. It was the home of a man who was not living, but merely existing. The awkwardness descended immediately. It was a silence thicker than the one outside. Elijah moved with a man's economy, stoking the fire, adding logs until it roared back to life, filling the room with flickering light and welcome heat. The sisters huddled near it, stripping off their wet shawls, their movements small and uncertain. They were like 2 stray cats, brought in from the cold, wary of the hand that fed them. "There's stew in the pot," Elijah said, gesturing to the hearth. "Help yourselves. I've got to see to the horse and bring in more wood." He escaped to the relative comfort of the barn. The familiar smells of hay and horse a balm to his jangled nerves. He worked slowly, deliberately, rubbing Samson down, checking his hooves, measuring out his feed. He was drawing out the time, postponing the moment he would have to return to the cabin and the 2 silent women who had so completely upended his world. What had he done? What madness had possessed him to bring them here? When he finally returned, lugging an armload of firewood, the scene inside had changed. The room was warmer, the stew was bubbling over the fire, and Clara was standing by his dry sink, a small counter with a bucket of water and a basin. She was methodically cleaning the few dishes he had left from his breakfast, her movements graceful and efficient. She had found a task, something to anchor her in this strange new place. He set the wood down by the fire and watched her for a moment. Unseen, the firelight played across her face, softening the harsh lines of fatigue. He noticed again the tremor in her hands as she washed a tin plate. He had thought it was just the cold before, but the cabin was warm now. He watched her pause, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the sink, taking a slow, deep breath before continuing. It wasn't just cold. It was hunger, a deep, gnawing hunger that had settled into her very bones, making her weak. A pang of something, pity, protectiveness, he wasn't sure what, went through him. He turned away, busying himself with the fire, feeling like an intruder in his own home. Later, they ate in silence around the table. He had pulled up a couple of crates for the women to sit on. The stew was thick with beef and potatoes, and he watched them eat, trying not to be obvious. Clara ate slowly, deliberately, as if she were afraid the food would vanish, but Violet ate with a fierce, desperate haste, her eyes downcast, not looking at him once. The only sounds were the scrape of spoons against tin bowls and the crackle of the fire. The silence was deafening. The days that followed fell into a strange, unwritten routine. The storm raged outside for 3 days, isolating them completely. Clara, it turned out, was a quiet force of nature. She took over the small domestic sphere of the cabin with a silent competence that both impressed and unsettled Elijah. She cooked, she cleaned. She mended a tear in his shirt with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She moved through his space with a quiet grace, asking for nothing, but slowly, imperceptibly, transforming it. The cabin began to feel less like a shelter and more like a home. Violet was a different matter. She was restless, a caged animal pacing the confines of their sanctuary. She helped, but her movements were sharp, impatient. She would follow him out to the barn to chop wood. Her brow furrowed in concentration as she swung the axe with a surprising strength. She seemed to be watching him constantly, her green eyes missing nothing. He would feel her gaze on him as he repaired a piece of tack or checked the stores in the lean-to. It wasn't a soft gaze. Like Clara's, it was sharp, analytical, almost possessive. It made the hair on the back of his neck prickle. One afternoon, the storm had lessened to a steady, blowing snow. He'd spent the morning in the barn, reinforcing a loose beam. The work was hard, and sweat had soaked through his woolen shirt despite the cold. Back inside the relative warmth of the barn, away from the biting wind, he decided to change into a dry one he kept on a hook. He shucked off his coat and, without thinking, pulled the damp, heavy shirt over his head. The cool air hit his bare skin, and he rolled his shoulders, working out the stiffness. He was reaching for the dry shirt when a sudden stillness from the corner of his eye made him pause. Violet was standing in the shadows by the hayloft ladder, a stack of feed sacks forgotten in her arms. Her eyes were wide, fixed on his bare back. He knew what she saw, a landscape of its own, mapped with the pale, silvery lines of old scars, a long-ago scrape with a barbed wire fence, a puckered mark from a fall onto sharp rock, the faint traces of a life lived hard. Her gaze was intense, unblinking. It wasn't just a glance. It was a study. He saw her throat move as she swallowed, a blush creeping up from the collar of her dress to stain her cheeks. It was a look of raw, unguarded curiosity, mixed with something else, something deeper and more startling that he couldn't immediately name. It was the look of a woman seeing a man for the first time, not as a savior, not as a stranger, but simply as a man. The moment stretched, taut and silent, thick with unspoken things. It felt intensely private, a violation of the careful distance they had all maintained. Then, as if waking from a trance, her eyes flew to his, and the color in her cheeks deepened to a fiery crimson. She looked utterly mortified, as if caught in a profound transgression. She dropped her gaze, spun around so quickly that a few grains of feed spilled from the sacks, and practically fled back toward the cabin. Her shoulders hunched as if she were trying to make herself invisible. Elijah stood there for a long moment, the cold air forgotten. He slowly pulled the dry shirt on, the rough wool scraping against his skin. The image of her wide, startled green eyes was burned into his mind. He had lived so long without being truly seen by anyone. Clara looked at him with a quiet gratitude, a shared weariness. But Violet had looked at him and seen something more. And in that moment, a door he had long thought bolted and barred creaked open just a crack, letting in a draft of something complicated and dangerous and terrifyingly alive. When the storm finally broke, it was as if the world was being born anew, scrubbed clean and glistening. The snow melted under a surprisingly warm sun, turning the red dust to a thick, sticky mud that clung to boots and wagon wheels with a greedy tenacity. The sky was a vast, aching blue, and the air, stripped of its biting wind, felt clean and sharp in the lungs. The silence the storm had imposed was replaced by the steady drip of melting snow from the cabin eaves and the distant, lonely lowing of cattle. The end of the storm was the end of their strange, suspended isolation. For 3 days, the cabin had been their entire world. Now, the world outside, with all its demands and dangers, came rushing back in. Elijah's ranch had taken a beating. A long section of fence on the north pasture was down. The posts snapped like twigs. The small stable where he kept Samson and a spare mare had lost a section of its roof, the shingles torn away by the wind, leaving a gaping wound open to the sky. The work was immense, a mountain of tasks he was used to facing alone, but now he wasn't. "You don't have to," he said that first morning, standing by the door, pulling on his stiff leather gloves. "The deal was for shelter through the storm. It's past. You're free to head to town." Clara was wiping down the table, her movements as deliberate as ever. She paused and looked at him, her gray eyes clear and direct. "The deal was we'd work for our keep. Elijah, we've kept... Now we work." Violet, who was sharpening a kitchen knife with a whetstone, looked up and added, "Besides, where would we go? We have a better chance of earning a meal here than begging for one in Redemption's Folly." There was a hard edge to her voice, but her eyes, when they met his, held a flicker of something else, a plea. And so, it was settled. The cabin was no longer a temporary refuge. It was a base of operations. He put them to work. He had expected them to be a hindrance, city women unaccustomed to the raw demands of the land. He was wrong. He took them with him to the north pasture, the mud sucking at their boots with every step. He showed Violet how to hold the fence posts steady while he drove them deep into the soft earth with a heavy mallet, the percussive thump, thump, thump echoing across the plains. She was surprisingly strong, her slender frame belying a core of wiry resilience. She didn't complain about the mud that splattered her dress or the splinters that pricked her hands. She worked with a grim, focused intensity, as if she were wrestling a demon only she could see. Clara, he found, had a different kind of strength. Her hands, though prone to trembling from want, were nimble and clever. While he and Violet did the heavy work of setting posts, she walked the line, painstakingly restringing the sharp, vicious barbed wire. Her fingers, wrapped in scraps of leather, twisting and tightening with a patient skill that amazed him. She worked like she did everything else, quietly, methodically, and without a single wasted motion. They became his shadows, his apprentices in the art of survival. He taught them how to read the tracks of a coyote, how to tell a healthy calf from a sick one by the look in its eye. One crisp afternoon, he took his rifle from its pegs on the wall and led them into the low, rolling hills behind the ranch. He moved with a hunter's grace, his long strides eating up the ground, and they followed, their breathing growing labored in the thin air. He tracked a small buck for over an hour before finding a clear shot. The crack of the rifle was a sharp, violent intrusion into the vast silence. He brought the animal down with a single, clean shot. He showed them how to field dress the deer, his movements economical and precise, wasting nothing. He saw Clara flinch and turn her head away at the sight of the blood. But Violet watched, her expression unreadable, her jaw set. Later, back at the cabin, they helped him cut the meat into thin strips to be salted and smoked, jerky that would sustain them for weeks. Life settled into a new rhythm, dictated by the sun and the seasons. It was a hard, unvarnished existence. Cooking was done over the open fire in the hearth, a constant battle to keep the heat even and the smoke out of their eyes. Bathing was a weekly ritual, a luxury afforded by heating pail after pail of well water. They would take turns, one sister standing guard by the cabin door, while the other washed hastily in a large wooden tub placed before the fire, the flickering light offering a poor substitute for privacy. Elijah would make himself scarce during these times, taking on some task in the far corners of the ranch, feeling like an awkward giant in a world that had suddenly shrunk. One evening, he was returning to the barn when he heard a sharp cry of pain. He quickened his pace and found Clara by the corral, her hand pressed to her side, her face pale, his spare mare, A flighty chestnut named Ginger had been spooked by a snake and kicked out, catching Clara in the ribs. "I'm all right," she insisted, her voice tight. "Just got the wind knocked out of me." But she wasn't all right. He gently probed her side, his calloused fingers surprisingly tender, and felt the unnatural give of broken ribs. He half carried her back to the cabin, ignoring her protests, and laid her carefully on her cot. Violet's face was a mask of worry, her earlier sharpness gone. "You'll need to bind them," he said, his voice low and commanding. He tore long strips from a clean bedsheet. "Violet, hold her steady." He worked with the quiet competence of a man who had long been his own doctor. He showed Violet how to wrap the bindings tightly around Clara's torso, supporting the broken bones. Clara bore the pain with a stoicism that tore at him. Her only sign of distress, the sweat that beaded on her upper lip and the way she bit down on her lower one until it was white. He gave her a weak brew of willow bark tea for the pain and sat by her side long after Violet had fallen into a fitful sleep on her own cot. In the dim firelight, with her defenses down, Clara looked achingly vulnerable. The quiet strength she projected every day was an armor, he realized, and he had just seen the chinks in it. It was in these quiet moments, in the shared space after a long day's work, that the walls between them began to crumble. The stories came out not in a rush, but in small, hesitant pieces, offered up like precious, fragile things. One night, as Clara sat by the fire, her breathing still shallow, he was mending a bridle, the awl moving surely in his hands. He was thinking of Sarah, of how she'd hated the smell of leather oil. "My wife, Sarah," he said, the words feeling strange on his tongue after so many years of silence. "She used to say you could smell this stuff from a mile away, said it was my own special perfume." Clara looked up from the sock she was darning, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "It's a good smell, an honest smell." A long silence settled between them, comfortable and deep. Then she said, her voice barely a whisper, "My husband, my late husband, Arthur, he smelled of whiskey and cheap cigars, even when he came home in the morning." Elijah stopped his work, his hands still. He looked at her, and in the flickering light, he saw the deep, old pain in her eyes. "He was not a kind man," she continued, her gaze fixed on the flames. "He had a quick temper and a wandering eye. I thought I could fix him. A woman's folly, I suppose, to think her love can be a cure for a man's broken soul." She took a shaky breath. "He died in a saloon in Fort Worth, a stupid argument over a card game. He drew on a man who was faster. It was senseless, utterly senseless." Her voice broke on the last word. "His family blamed me. They said I drove him to it. They turned me out of the house the day after the funeral, with nothing, not even a photograph of my own mother." Elijah didn't know what to say. The simple, brutal cruelty of it left him speechless. He just sat there, the half-mended bridle forgotten in his lap, and listened to the sound of her quiet sorrow filling the space between them. Violet's story came out in a burst of anger a few days later. Elijah had been trying to teach her how to properly saddle Samson, but she was impatient, pulling the cinch too tight, making the horse sidle nervously. "Easy, Violet," he said gently. "You can't force it. You have to work with him." "I'm tired of being told to be easy," she snapped, whirling on him, her green eyes blazing. "I'm tired of men telling me what to do and how to do it." The outburst was so sudden, so fierce, it took him aback. Clara, who was coming from the cabin with a bucket of water, stopped in her tracks. "Violet," Clara said, her voice a soft warning. "No!" Violet's voice was high and strained. She gestured wildly, not at Elijah, but at the world. "He deserves to know. You think we ended up on that roadside by chance? Our father, he was a good man, but a terrible gambler. He owed money, a lot of it, to a man named Silas Croft, a man older than he was, rich, powerful, and cruel." Her breath hitched. To clear the debt, he promised me to Silas. I was to be his wife, 21 years old, and sold like a broodmare. She looked at Elijah, her eyes filled with a desperate, defiant shame. I saw what he did to his servants. I heard the stories. I knew what my life would be, a gilded cage, to be used and discarded. So, the night before the wedding, Clara helped me pack a bag, and we ran. We've been running ever since. The pieces clicked into place. Her defensiveness, her restless energy, her fierce need for independence. It was the frantic struggle of a creature that had narrowly escaped a trap. He saw not a sharp-tongued girl, but a terrified woman fighting for her very life. That night, the atmosphere in the cabin was thick with the weight of their shared histories. They were 3 survivors, each scarred in their own way, huddled together against a world that had tried to break them. The wind had picked up again, rattling the shutters and moaning in the chimney. The lamp on the table, low on oil, sputtered and flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Violet had turned in early, exhausted by her emotional storm. Elijah and Clara sat before the fire, the silence between them no longer awkward, but filled with a deep, unspoken understanding. He looked at her, at the profile of her face illuminated by the firelight, the quiet strength in the set of her jaw, the sorrow that still lingered in the corners of her mouth. He saw a resilience that matched the harsh beauty of the land itself. The lamp on the table gave one last, desperate flicker and died, plunging the room into a deep gloom, lit only by the dying red embers in the hearth. The sudden darkness was intimate. "I should get more oil," he said, his voice sounding too loud in the quiet. "No," she said softly. "It's late. Let it be." A chill was creeping into the room as the fire burned low. He saw her shiver, pulling her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. Without thinking, he reached for the heavy wool blanket from the end of his bed and unfolded it. "Here," he said, his voice rough. He draped it over her shoulders, and then, because there seemed to be nowhere else to go, he sat on the hearth beside her, close enough that the blanket covered them both. The warmth of her body next to his was a shock. It had been years since he had felt the simple, profound comfort of another person's presence in the dark. He could smell the faint, clean scent of her hair, something like rain and soap. All the loneliness he had kept at bay for 4 years, all the grief he had buried under endless work, came rushing to the surface. It was an ache so profound it felt physical, a hollowness in his chest. He saw that she was looking at him, her gray eyes wide and luminous in the firelight. He saw the same loneliness reflected there, the same deep, human need for comfort, for connection. The air grew thick, charged with unspoken feelings. The world shrank to the small, warm space beneath the blanket. Slowly, instinctively, he leaned toward her. It wasn't a decision. It was a gravitational pull, an impulse as natural as drawing breath. He saw her eyes flutter closed, her lips parting slightly. He was a breath away, the promise of her warmth a revelation, when she suddenly stiffened. Her eyes snapped open, and in them he saw a flash of fear, of memory, the ghost of Arthur, of betrayal and pain, stood between them. She pulled back, not violently, but with a quiet, heartbreaking finality. The blanket slipped from her shoulders as she rose to her feet. I'm tired," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Good night, Elijah." She turned and fled to the relative safety of her cot in the corner, leaving him alone by the dying fire, the warmth of her presence replaced by a sudden, aching cold. The next morning, the sun rose bright and unforgiving. The tension between Elijah and Clara was a palpable thing. A taut wire stretched between them. They moved around each other with a careful, clumsy grace, their eyes refusing to meet. The easy companionship of the past weeks was gone, replaced by a guarded formality. Violet noticed immediately. She was quiet during breakfast, her sharp eyes darting from her sister's pale, strained face to Elijah's grim, unreadable expression. She saw the way Clara's hand trembled when she passed him the coffee pot, the way he flinched almost imperceptibly when their fingers brushed. She saw the new distance between them, and a storm began to brew behind her own green eyes. She became sullen and withdrawn. When Elijah gave instructions for the day's work, re-roofing the stable, she followed them with a clipped, resentful obedience. The easy banter they had sometimes shared was gone. She worked in a tight, angry silence, her movements jerky and efficient. She directed all her questions and comments to Clara, pointedly ignoring Elijah as if he were a ghost. He felt caught in an invisible crossfire. He was adrift on a sea of female emotions he had no chart for. He tried to act as if nothing had happened, but the air was too thick with unspoken things. He found himself retreating into the familiar comfort of silence. But it was no longer a peaceful silence. It was a silence filled with the weight of two women's gazes. Clara's was full of apology and regret, a quiet sorrow for what had almost been and what could now never be. But Violet's gaze was different. It followed him throughout the day, sharp and possessive and tinged with a deep, unsettling hurt. It was the look of a woman who felt she had been betrayed, though he couldn't fathom how or why. The question in her eyes was a burning one, and it made him deeply, profoundly uneasy. He was a simple man, used to simple problems, a broken fence, a sick cow, a coming storm. He had no idea how to navigate this new, treacherous landscape of the human heart. He only knew that he was lost, caught between two sisters, and the path forward was shrouded in a fog he could not see through. The awkward truce forged in the wake of that night by the fire held for weeks, fragile as a spider's web in the morning mist. They worked, they ate, they slept under the same roof, moving through the days in a state of quiet, polite estrangement. The space between Elijah and Clara was a chasm of unspoken words, while the air between him and Violet was charged with a tense, watchful energy. It was a silence that screamed, a stillness that vibrated with everything left unsaid. But the land itself cared nothing for the turmoil of human hearts. Spring arrived in earnest, not with gentle grace, but with the same fierce, untamed spirit as the rest of the seasons. The mud dried and cracked into a mosaic of red earth. Patches of defiant blue bonnets and Indian paintbrush erupted across the plains, a riot of color against the endless brown and green. The air grew soft and warm, carrying the scent of damp soil and new life. The cattle grew sleek on the fresh grass, and the days stretched long and golden. News of the world beyond their small triangle of existence came with a traveling farrier, a wiry old man named Jedediah, who stopped at the ranch to shoe Samson. He brought with him tales from Redemption's Folly, his words painting a picture of a town shaking off the last of winter's gloom. "Big spring festival next Saturday," he announced, spitting a stream of tobacco juice that sizzled on the hot ground. "Been planning it for months. There'll be horse races, a shooting competition, a town picnic, and a barn dance in the evening. The whole county will be there." Elijah just grunted in response, testing the new shoe on Samson's hoof. But from the corner of his eye, he saw Violet's face light up. It was the first genuine, uncomplicated spark of joy he had seen in her for weeks. Her eyes, which had been so often clouded with resentment, were suddenly bright with longing. A longing for music, for laughter, for the simple, bustling life of a community. A longing to be a young woman of 22 instead of a fugitive and a laborer. Later that evening, as they sat down to a supper of fried bacon and beans, she brought it up. Her voice was carefully casual, but the underlying hope was unmistakable. "A dance," she said, looking at the table rather than at either of them. "It's been so long since I heard music that wasn't just the wind." Clara shot her a warning look, a slight, almost imperceptible shake of her head, but Violet ignored it. She looked directly at Elijah, her chin lifted. "I'd like to go." Elijah set his fork down, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet cabin. He knew this was coming. He had seen the desire in her eyes, And he knew, with a heavy certainty, what his answer had to be. "We're not going," he said, his voice flat. "Why not?" Violet challenged, her hopeful expression hardening into one of defiance. "The work is caught up. We've earned a night off." "It's not about the work," he said, his gaze steady. "Towns like Redemption's Folly. They talk. They've got long memories and short tempers. A man living alone is one thing. A man living alone with two women, that's another." "So, we're to be prisoners here," she shot back, her voice rising. "Hiding because you're afraid of what a few gossiping hens might say?" "I'm not afraid," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I'm being careful. For your sake, for Clara's. You don't know what people are like. They'll see what they want to see, and they'll pass judgment like it's the word of God." "Let them," Violet said, a bitter curl to her lip. "I've faced worse than whispers." "Violet, that's enough," Clara intervened, her voice soft but firm. "Elijah is right. It would be unwise." Violet threw her fork down onto her plate with a clatter. She pushed back from the table, her chair scraping harshly against the wood floor. "Unwise," she repeated, her voice dripping with scorn. She looked from Clara's weary, conciliatory face to Elijah's grim, resolute one. "You're both cowards." She stormed out of the cabin, slamming the door behind her, leaving a vibrating silence in her wake. The truth of Elijah's words became painfully clear 2 days later when their supply of flour ran out, forcing a trip to town. He had intended to go alone, but Clara insisted she come, needing thread and other womanly necessities. And Violet, in her silent, stubborn way, simply climbed into the back of the buckboard wagon, daring him to tell her to get out. Redemption's Folly wasn't much of a town. It was a single dusty street lined with a dozen or so false-fronted buildings, a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, a church, and a handful of houses, but as they drove down that street, it felt like the whole world was watching. The whispers started almost immediately. Women, sweeping their porches, stopped to stare, their eyes narrowed with a cold, dissecting curiosity. They looked from Elijah's weathered face to Clara's dignified but worn beauty, and then to Violet's youthful, defiant glare. Their gazes lingered, speculative and sharp, stripping the sisters of their anonymity and branding them as something other, something suspect. Men, lounging outside the saloon, stopped their whittling and talking. Their looks were different, a mix of crude assessment and knowing smirks. Elijah could feel their eyes on the women, could almost hear the sordid stories they were already weaving in their minds. He kept his face a granite mask, staring straight ahead, his hands tight on the reins. But he could feel the women's reactions as if they were his own, beside him. Clara seemed to shrink, her shoulders, usually held so straight, curved inward. She pulled her bonnet lower, hiding her face, a flush of deep, painful shame coloring her cheeks. She looked like a woman who wanted the earth to open up and swallow her whole. But in the back, Violet sat ramrod straight. She didn't hide. She met every stare with a look of pure, unadulterated fury, her green eyes blazing. Her anger was a shield. But Elijah could see the fine tremor in her hands, the tightness around her mouth. It was the rage of the powerless, the desperate defiance of someone being judged and condemned without a trial. The visit was an exercise in misery. Inside the general store, the proprietor was unctuously polite, but his wife watched their every move. Her lips pursed in a thin line of disapproval. The transaction was swift, the air thick with unspoken accusation. They left as quickly as they could, the weight of the town's collective gaze following them until the last building had disappeared behind them. The ride back to the ranch was a long, heavy silence. The damage was done. The fortress of their isolation had been breached, and the poison of the outside world had seeped in. That night, after a supper eaten in near total silence, Clara waited until Violet had gone outside to fetch water. She turned to Elijah, her face pale and resolved in the lamplight. "I'll be leaving in the morning," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Elijah stared at her, stunned. "Leaving? Leaving to where?" "To town. I'll find work. At the saloon, perhaps, or cleaning at the boarding house. Something—" "That's crazy," he said, his voice rough with disbelief. "After what happened today? You saw how they looked at you. It's no place for you." "It's because of today that I must go," she said, her gray eyes filled with a deep, weary sadness. "They were looking at me, Elijah, but they were judging you. I will not be the cause of your ruin. You are a good man. You have a reputation, a standing in this place. I will not allow my situation to tarnish that." Before he could argue, the door opened and Violet entered, the water bucket sloshing in her hand. She stopped short, her eyes darting between them, sensing the gravity of the conversation. "What's going on?" "Your sister thinks she's leaving," Elijah said, his gaze still locked on Clara. Clara turned to Violet. "It's for the best. We can't stay here forever. We're bringing shame on him." Violet set the bucket down with a thud, water splashing over the rim. "Shame?" she cried, her voice incredulous. "You felt ashamed today. I felt angry that those narrow-minded, hypocritical people dared to look at us like that, and you want to run away from it?" "It is not running away, Violet. It is doing the honorable thing." "Honorable?" Violet's laugh was a sharp, bitter sound. "You call leaving the one safe place we've found honorable? You call walking back into the fire that nearly burned us alive honorable?" She took a step closer to her sister, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "You always do this, Clara. Whenever things get difficult, whenever there's a risk, you retreat. You give up. You did it with Arthur's family. You did it every time we were turned away from a job. You just accept defeat." Her voice dropped, thick with an emotion that was raw and painful. "But not me. Not this time." She turned her blazing eyes on Elijah. "I want to stay. I want to stay for him." The declaration hung in the air, stunning both Elijah and Clara into silence. It was a confession, a challenge, and a cry from the heart all at once. Clara looked as though she'd been struck, her face paling even further. Elijah felt a knot tighten in his gut. Clara, her voice a wounded whisper, said, "Violet, you don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying," Violet retorted, never taking her eyes off Elijah. She turned and fled the cabin for the second time in as many days, leaving an even deeper, more catastrophic silence in her wake. Elijah found her in the barn. She was standing in the center aisle, bathed in the silvery light of a full moon filtering through the open hayloft door. She wasn't crying. She was vibrating with a fierce, contained energy. "Violet," he started, his voice sounding inadequate. She turned to face him. "Did you hear me, Elijah? I'm not leaving. You can't make me—" "That's not what this is about." "Isn't it?" she interrupted, taking a step toward him. "Then what is it about? Tell me you don't feel it. Tell me you don't feel something when I'm near you." He was completely out of his depth. "You're a young woman. You've got your whole life ahead of you. You shouldn't be wasting it here. With me." "Wasting it?" Her voice was incredulous. "You saved my life. You both did. You and Clara. You gave me a home when I had nothing." Her eyes softened, the anger replaced by a vulnerable intensity that struck him to the core. I think I've loved you since that first day, during the storm. I was so cold, so scared. You came in from the barn, your coat covered in snow, and you saw me shivering. You didn't say a word. You just took a dry horse blanket from a hook and put it around my shoulders. It was rough, and it smelled of hay and leather, and it was the kindest, safest thing I had ever felt." The memory was vague to him, a small, thoughtless gesture in a moment of crisis. But to her, it had been everything. He searched for the right words, the kind words. the words that would gently push her away without breaking her. "Violet, I care for you, I do, but I'm old enough to be your father. I think of you like a daughter or a younger sister." The words were a lie, or at least a half-truth, and they sounded hollow even to his own ears. The way he felt when she looked at him was not the way a man felt about a daughter. A shadow of pain crossed her face, but she didn't back down. She closed the distance between them until she was standing directly in front of him, so close he could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. She reached up, her hand surprisingly steady, and laid it gently on his cheek. "Do you?" she whispered, her voice husky. And then she rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his cheek. It wasn't a passionate kiss. It was soft, warm, and achingly tender. A simple, honest expression of everything she felt. The touch was like a lightning strike, a jolt of warmth and life that shot through his entire body, short-circuiting every one of his carefully constructed defenses. For a long moment, he forgot to breathe. His mind, which had been racing for a way to escape, went utterly blank. He was shaken to his very foundation, not by passion, but by the disarming purity of her affection. As her lips left his skin, a floorboard creaked near the barn door. They both turned. Clara stood there, half hidden in the shadows, her hand frozen on the doorframe. Her eyes met Elijah's for a fleeting second, and in them, he saw a universe of shock and a pain so profound it stole the air from his lungs. She didn't say a word. She didn't cry out. She simply pulled her hand back as if burned, turned with a deathly quietness, and disappeared back into the night. That night, the cabin felt like a tomb. Each of them was locked in their own private agony. Elijah lay on his cot, staring into the darkness, the feeling of Violet's lips still ghosting on his cheek. The image of Clara's devastated eyes burned onto the back of his eyelids. He was a man caught in a current, being swept toward a rocky shore, with no idea how to swim. Finally, unable to bear the suffocating silence any longer, he rose. He crossed the short distance that separated their living spaces, a gulf that now felt 1,000 miles wide, and stood by Clara's cot. She wasn't asleep. He could see the faint glint of moonlight on the unshed tears tracking silently down her temples. She didn't turn to look at him. He knelt on the floor beside her, a gesture of supplication. "Clara," he whispered, his voice thick with a miserable confusion. "I'm sorry." He waited for an accusation, for anger, for tears. He got nothing but her continued, heartbreaking silence. "I don't know what to do," he confessed, the words torn from him. "I don't know what's right anymore. I tried to tell her no. I tried to do the honorable thing." He took a ragged breath, the truth finally forcing its way out. "But God help me? Clara, you and Violet, you're both living in my heart. One of you is the calm, the other is the storm. And I don't know how to live without the sun and the rain both. I don't know how to do the right thing." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, she slowly turned her head on the pillow to face him. Her eyes, even filled with tears, were steady. She reached out and laid her cool, trembling hand on his. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was a ragged whisper, but it held the weight of a hard-won truth. "We are survivors. Elijah, you, me, Violet, that's what we are. First and foremost." She squeezed his hand. "Sometimes, living true is more important than living right." Clara's words. Sometimes, living true is more important than living right. Did not settle the storm inside the cabin. They unleashed it. They were an absolution and a damnation all in one. A key that unlocked a door Elijah had never dared to approach. The silence that followed was no longer one of tension or awkwardness. It was the profound, electric stillness that comes in the moments before a lightning strike. He remained kneeling by her cot, her hand in his, the simple touch a brand on his soul. Outside, the heavens seemed to agree. The wind, which had been a low moan, rose to a frantic shriek. throwing itself against the sturdy log walls of the cabin. A low rumble of thunder that had been grumbling on the horizon for hours drew closer. A beast stalking the plains. Then the rain came, not as a drizzle, but as a sudden, violent deluge. A solid sheet of water that hammered against the roof and sluiced down the single-glass window pane in murky waves. Clara withdrew her hand from his and rose from her cot. For a moment, Elijah thought she was retreating again, sending him back to his side of the room, to the lonely reality he had known, but she did not. She walked to the fireplace, her bare feet silent on the wooden floorboards. The fire had burned down to a deep, hypnotic bed of scarlet embers, casting a pulsating, hellish glow that painted her in shades of red and deep shadow. She stood there, her back to him, a silhouette of profound and resolute stillness against the dying heart of the fire. He watched her, his own heart a wild drum against his ribs. Every instinct, every rule of a decent, God-fearing life he had ever known screamed at him to stay where he was. But his heart, that treacherous, newly awakened thing, urged him to rise. He pushed himself to his feet, the joints in his knees cracking in the charged silence. As if sensing his movement, she turned to face him. Her long, dark hair was unbraided, tumbling over the shoulders of her simple cotton nightdress. Her face, illuminated by the embers, was a mask of raw, unconcealed emotion. The weariness was there, the sorrow was there, but beneath it was something new, something he had never seen in her before, a fierce, unyielding resolve. A decision had been made. She took a step toward him, and another. She did not hesitate. This was not the frightened woman who had pulled away from him beneath the blanket. This was the survivor, the woman who had buried a loveless husband, who had faced down poverty and disgrace, who had chosen to live true. The first flash of lightning bleached the room in a ghostly, instantaneous white light. In that stark, revealing moment, he saw the glint of tears on her cheeks. But her expression was not one of weakness. It was one of profound, aching need. The thunder that followed was immediate and explosive, a deafening crack that shook the very foundations of the cabin, as if the world outside were splitting apart. She didn't flinch. She simply stopped when she was a breath away from him. He could feel the heat radiating from her skin, could smell the scent of rain and wood smoke that clung to her. She raised a hand, the one that had so often trembled from hunger and cold, and laid it flat against the center of his chest. Through the rough fabric of his shirt, he felt the touch as if it were a hot iron. He could feel the beating of his own heart against her palm. "Elijah," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing, but her gaze was unwavering. He had no words. There were no words for the cataclysm that was unfolding within him. He covered her hand with his own, his large, calloused fingers engulfing hers. Her skin was cool, her bones delicate beneath his grip. This was it, the precipice, the point of no return. He lowered his head, and this time, she did not pull away. This time, she rose to meet him. Their first kiss was not gentle. It was a collision of loneliness and desperation. A frantic, searching thing filled with the salt of her tears and the unspoken grief of years. It was a drowning man's gasp for air, a starving man's first taste of bread. It was steeped in sorrow, a lament for his lost Sarah, for her wasted years with Arthur, for all the pain that had brought them to this impossible moment. His arms went around her, pulling her flush against him, and he felt a shudder rack her entire body, a sob of surrender and release. She was so small, so fragile in his arms, yet he felt as though he were holding the very center of the storm. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing, and carried her the few steps to his cot, the embers of the fire painting their path in a bloody, flickering light. What happened next was not a wild, thoughtless passion. It was a slow, deliberate discovery, a sacred and profane communion. Every touch was both a question and an answer. He unlaced her nightdress with fumbling, unpracticed hands, and she helped him, her own fingers tracing the hard, scarred landscape of his shoulders and back, in the deep, resonant darkness between flashes of lightning. They shed not just their clothes, but the heavy armor of their pasts. It was a strange and holy thing, an act of profound intimacy that was as much about solace as it was about desire. It was the quiet, desperate comfort of two bodies, two souls, who had been alone for too long. For Elijah, it was an awakening from a long, gray dream, a shocking, vibrant return to a world of sensation he thought was lost to him forever. For Clara, it was a reclamation. It was the first time she had been touched with tenderness, with a reverence that bordered on worship. It was a healing, a painful and beautiful stitching back together of a spirit that had been torn and frayed. They moved together with the rhythm of the storm, a slow, building crescendo that finally broke in a wave of release so profound it felt like both a death and a rebirth, leaving them clinging to one another in the echoing silence as the rain continued to beat its steady, cleansing rhythm on the roof. The next morning, the world was washed clean. The air was cool and smelled of wet earth and pine. A hazy, pale sunlight filtered through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the still air. The cabin was quiet. Elijah woke first. He was alone in his cot. For a disoriented moment, he thought he had dreamed it all, but the scent of her was on his pillow, and the memory of her warmth was a phantom presence against his skin. He sat up, his body aching with a tenderness that was both physical and emotional. He saw Clara across the room, already dressed, stoking the morning fire. She moved with her usual quiet grace, but there was a new stillness about her, a deep, settled calm in her eyes when she finally looked at him. There was no shame, no regret, only a quiet acknowledgement of the new world they had woken up in. It was then that he noticed it. The third cot, the one tucked in the far corner, was empty. Not just empty, but neatly made, the thin blanket pulled taut, the small pillow perfectly placed. Violet was gone. A cold dread, sharp and immediate, seized him. "Clara, where's Violet?" Clara's calm expression faltered. A shadow of deep worry crossed her face. "I don't know. When I woke, just before dawn, she was gone. Her shawl is missing, and a small sack of food. There was no note." He was out of the cot in an instant, pulling on his trousers and boots with a frantic haste. The new, fragile peace of the morning was shattered. Guilt, sharp and acidic, rose in his throat. He had been so lost in Clara, in their shared solace, that he had utterly forgotten the third person in their fractured triangle. He had forgotten the young woman with the wounded, watchful eyes. He burst out of the cabin. The ground was a sea of mud, and the sky was a bruised, unsettled gray. He scanned the horizon in every direction. Nothing, just the vast, empty plains, indifferent and silent. He ran to the barn. Her horse, a skittish little mare they had bought in town weeks ago, was also gone. She had run, just as she had run from Silas Croft. She had run from this, from a pain she couldn't bear to witness, and she had run into a wilderness that was treacherous even for a seasoned man, a landscape of swollen creeks and hidden gullies, still dangerous from the storm. "Samson!" he roared, his voice raw with panic. He threw the saddle on his gelding with a speed born of terror, his hands working the buckles and straps with a muscle memory that bypassed his chaotic thoughts. Clara appeared at the barn door, her face a mask of fear. "Be careful, Elijah," she pleaded. "The ground is soft." He barely heard her. He swung himself into the saddle, wheeled Samson around, and dug his heels into the horse's flanks. They shot out of the barn, mud flying from Samson's powerful hooves, and headed toward the low, timbered hills to the west, the only place she could have gone to truly hide. The ride was a nightmare. The familiar trails were gone, washed away or turned into thick, impassable bogs of red mud. He was forced to navigate by instinct, pushing Samson through thickets of thorny mesquite and across creeks that had become raging, muddy torrents. The air was heavy and humid, and the sky grew darker, threatening more rain. He was deep in a thick stand of pine when the storm, which had been gathering its breath, returned for a final, violent encore. A sudden, blinding fork of lightning struck a massive pine tree not 50 yards away. The flash and the explosive crack of thunder simultaneous. The tree split with a sound like the sky tearing in half, a shower of splinters and burning wood erupting from its trunk. Samson, a steady and reliable beast, lost his nerve. He screamed, a high, terrified sound, and reared violently, his front hooves pawing at the air. Elijah, caught off guard, was thrown from the saddle. He landed hard, his shoulders slamming into the wet, unforgiving earth, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs. For a moment, the world went black, filled with a nauseating swirl of pain and panic. Samson, wild-eyed with terror, bolted, crashing blindly through the undergrowth, the empty saddle a useless burden on his back. Elijah lay there for a long moment, gasping for air, a sharp, searing pain shooting from his shoulder down his arm. He pushed himself up, his vision swimming. He was alone, on foot and injured, and Violet was still out here, somewhere in this wild, unforgiving place. A cold, hard despair threatened to overwhelm him, but he forced it down. He couldn't give up. He gritted his teeth against the pain, got to his feet, and started walking, following the faint tracks the mare had left in the soft earth. He tracked her for what felt like an eternity, his shoulder a constant, throbbing agony. The trail led him higher, out of the thick timber and onto a series of rocky bluffs that overlooked the entire valley. The rain had softened to a fine, persistent drizzle that soaked through his shirt and plastered his hair to his forehead. And then he saw her. She was sitting on the edge of a high cliff, her legs dangling over the dizzying drop. Her mare was tethered to a scrubby cedar a few yards away. She was huddled in her thin shawl, a small, lonely figure against the vast, gray emptiness of the sky. She was staring out at the horizon, so lost in her thoughts that she didn't hear him approach. He stopped a few feet behind her, his heart aching at the sight of her desolate solitude. "Violet," he said, his voice a hoarse croak. She started whirling around, her eyes wide with shock. Relief warred with a deep, sorrowful pain on her face. "Elijah, you found me." "I'll always find you," he said, the words coming from a place deeper than thought. He took a step closer, his bad shoulder protesting with a fresh wave of pain. He winced, and she saw it. "You're hurt," she said, scrambling to her feet. "It's nothing. Horse got spooked by the lightning." He looked at her, at the tear tracks on her dirt-streaked cheeks, at the utter misery in her eyes. "Why did you run?" She looked away, back toward the edge of the cliff. "I heard you last night, with Clara." Her voice was flat, devoid of accusation. "I woke up, and I heard I couldn't stay. I couldn't lie there and listen to know it was her you chose." "I didn't choose," he said, the words feeling heavy and inadequate. She gave a small, bitter laugh. "Didn't you?" She finally turned to face him fully, the fine rain glistening on her face like tears. "It's all right, Elijah. I don't blame you. I blame myself. I blame myself for still wanting to be held by you every night, even knowing you could never be mine alone." Her raw, heartbreaking honesty shattered the last of his defenses. The pain in his shoulder, the exhaustion, the fear, it all melted away, replaced by an overwhelming, protective tenderness. He closed the distance between them and knelt before her in the wet grass, ignoring the searing pain. He reached out with his good arm and pulled her into a fierce, desperate embrace. She stiffened for a moment, then collapsed against him, her body shaking with silent, racking sobs. She buried her face in the crook of his neck, and he just held her, stroking her damp hair, whispering her name over and over like a prayer. He held her until the storm inside her began to subside. until her sobs quieted into shuddering breaths. She pulled back just enough to look at him, her green eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Don't make promises you can't keep. Elijah," she whispered. "I'm not making any promises," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Except one." He leaned in and captured her lips with his own. The kiss was nothing like the one he had shared with Clara. It wasn't about solace or healing. It was fire and rain. It was fueled by her fierce, youthful passion and his desperate need to erase the pain from her eyes. It was a kiss of raw, possessive hunger, a claiming. She responded with an intensity that stole his breath, her hands tangling in his hair, pulling him closer. The gentle rain fell around them, a soft, insistent rhythm, washing the world away until there was nothing left but the two of them, on the edge of the world, locked in an embrace that defied all logic and reason. It was a moment of complete and utter surrender, a wild, beautiful, and terrifying leap into the unknown. They returned to the ranch 2 days later. When the sun was finally strong enough to bake the mud hard, they were two changed people, walking in a bubble of exhausted, fragile silence. Samson had found his own way back to the barn, and Violet's mare followed them meekly. The journey was a blur of unspoken emotions, of furtive, intense glances and the simple, grounding touch of her hand on his arm. Clara was on the porch, mending a shirt. When they rode into the yard, she looked up, and her hands stilled in her lap. Her face was a perfect, unreadable mask. She simply watched them dismount, watched Violet automatically move to take the reins of his horse, her movements proprietary and sure. That evening, the tension in the cabin was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. Words were a currency none of them possessed. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the clink of cutlery against tin plates. After the meal, as Clara began to clear the table, Violet walked over to where Elijah was standing by the hearth, nursing his aching shoulder. She reached up and placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch light but firm, a silent, public declaration. She began to gently knead the bruised muscles, her eyes never leaving his face. Elijah stood there, frozen between the two sisters. He looked over at Clara. She had stopped, a plate in her hand, and was watching them. Her face was pale, but her expression was one of profound, stoic acceptance. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging a truth she had already made her peace with. Then she turned and quietly went back to her work. No one left. The silence held, heavy and absolute. But it was no longer a silence of estrangement. It was the silence of a new, terrifying, and unbreakable pact. They were 3 points of a triangle, bound together by love and pain and a shared, impossible truth. They had stepped off the edge of the world, and they had found, to their astonishment, that they had not fallen. They were simply floating, together, in the vast, uncharted territory of the heart. The fragile truce born of their return from the cliffs held through the last, gentle weeks of spring. It was a life lived on the surface. They spoke of the weather, of the mending that needed to be done, of the new calf born to a rangy-looking heifer. They did not speak of the night of the storm, nor of the day on the cliff's edge. They did not speak of the way Violet's hand now sometimes lingered on Elijah's arm, or the profound, ancient sorrow that still lived in the depths of Clara's eyes. They existed in a delicate, 3-pointed orbit, held together and pushed apart by forces they did not dare to name. Then summer came, and it came with a vengeance. The sun rose each day not as a promise of light, but as a brassy, malevolent eye in a cloudless, white-hot sky. The soft greens of spring were baked away, leaving the plains a uniform, bleached-out tan. The grass turned to tinder, crunching underfoot like broken glass. The earth itself cracked, great fissures opening in the baked red clay as if the land were grimacing in pain. The creek that cut through the north pasture dwindled to a string of stagnant, algae-choked pools before disappearing entirely, leaving behind a scar of sun-bleached stones. It was a season of thirst. The cattle, their ribs beginning to show, stood listlessly in the meager shade of the mesquite trees, their heads hanging low, tongues occasionally lolling out to lick at the dry, dusty air. The world shrank. The horizon shimmered with heat devils, making the distance a liar. The only sounds were the incessant, maddening buzz of flies and the whine of a hot, dry wind that offered no relief, only a further stripping of moisture from the land and from the soul. Their lives became a singular, desperate battle for water. The main well, the one closest to the cabin, was their lifeline. It was old, dug by Elijah's father 30 years before, and the mechanism for drawing the water was a testament to frontier ingenuity and repair. A heavy oak bucket was attached to a long, fraying rope that wound around a creaking wooden axle, turned by a heavy iron crank. The work was brutal. Each turn of the crank was a fight against gravity and the dead weight of the water hauled up from the deep, cool dark. They took turns at the crank, their hands blistered and raw, their backs aching. But as the drought wore on, the water level dropped. The rope had to go deeper. The bucket came up less full, and the work became exponentially harder. The water itself began to taste of earth and minerals, a brackish, unsatisfying brew that did little to quench a desperate thirst. The day it happened, the heat was a physical presence, a weight that pressed down, making breath a conscious effort. It was Elijah's turn at the well. He had sent the sisters to the relative cool of the cabin, unable to bear watching their strained faces, the way the sweat plastered their hair to their temples. He worked with a grim, steady rhythm, his muscles bunched and straining, sweat dripping from his chin to form dark spots in the red dust at his feet. The bucket was nearing the top, heavy and sloshing with precious, life-giving water. He gave the crank one final, powerful turn. There was a sound, a sharp, sickening snap, like a pistol shot in the still, hot air. The old rope, weakened by years of sun and strain, had finally given way. The iron crank handle, suddenly released from all tension, spun backward with a vicious, uncontrollable speed. Elijah had no time to react. The heavy handle slammed into the side of his head with a sickening crunch of metal against bone. He cried out, a sharp, guttural sound, and staggered backward. The world dissolved into a black, roaring vortex of pain. He collapsed like a felled tree, his head striking a jagged rock at the well's edge, and lay still in the suffocating heat. A dark, sluggish pool of blood beginning to spread from a gash on his temple into the thirsty red dust. It was Violet who found him. She had come out with a tin cup of water, her worry overriding his command to stay inside. Her scream was a thin, terrified sound that was swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence of the plains. Clara came running, her face ashen. Together, they were a study in desperate, frantic strength. They half-dragged, half-carried his dead weight back to the cabin, his boots leaving 2 long, ragged furrows in the dust. They got him onto his cot, his big frame seeming to overwhelm the small space. His skin was pale and clammy beneath his tan, his breathing shallow and ragged. The cut on his temple was deep, an ugly, weeping wound that they cleaned as best they could with their dwindling supply of clean water and whiskey from a dusty bottle on a high shelf. For the first day, he was simply unconscious, lost in a deep, black well of his own. The sisters moved around him in a state of quiet, hyper-focused panic. They spoke only when necessary, their voices hushed whispers. More water. Tear another strip of cloth. See if he's breathing. The tension that had defined their relationship for months was burned away by the raw, unifying flame of fear. There was no Clara, no Violet. There were only 2 women fighting to keep the center of their world from collapsing. By the second day, the fever set in. It came on with a terrifying swiftness. His skin, once clammy, grew hot and dry to the touch, radiating a heat that seemed to come from the very core of his being. A dark, angry red began to creep around the edges of his wound. Infection. The word hung unspoken in the stifling air of the cabin. a death sentence in this isolated place. He began to thrash, his powerful body fighting against invisible demons. And then he began to talk. His words were a fever dream, a jumbled, broken stream of consciousness that flowed from the depths of his delirious mind. He was a boy again, chasing lizards in the sun. He was a young man, holding his Sarah's hand by the creek. He was a father, his voice thick with a ghostly tenderness as he whispered the name. Jacob. The sisters sat vigil, their own exhaustion a distant, unimportant thing. They took turns bathing his forehead with cool, damp cloths, trying to force sips of water between his cracked, dry lips. They listened, their hearts aching, as he wandered through the landscapes of his past. Then, in the deep, suffocating heat of the third night, his ramblings shifted from the distant past to the immediate present. "Clara," he murmured, his head tossing restlessly on the sweat-soaked pillow. "The rain, it's safe now. In the quiet, after the storm." His hand, hot and dry, fumbled across the blanket as if searching for hers. Clara, sitting by his side, took it instinctively. His fingers, surprisingly strong even in his delirium, closed around hers, and for a moment he grew calm, a look of peace settling on his face. Violet, watching from the foot of the cot, felt a familiar, sharp pang of exclusion, of being the second choice, the outsider. She looked away, her jaw tight. But a few moments later, he began to stir again, a low moan escaping his lips. He pulled his hand from Clara's grasp, his brow furrowed in distress. "Violet," he whispered, his voice suddenly urgent, filled with a phantom terror. "The cliff! Don't run! Don't! The fire! Green fire in your eyes!" he cried out, a short, sharp sound of pain and fear. "Don't leave me!" Violet moved to his side, her earlier resentment forgotten, replaced by a wave of overwhelming compassion. She took the damp cloth from Clara and gently began to bathe his face. He seemed to sense her presence, her specific touch. His thrashing subsided. "Violet," he murmured again, this time with a deep, shuddering sigh of relief, and he lapsed back into a fitful, but less troubled, sleep. The two sisters stood there in the lamplight, on either side of the man who bound them together, the man who was dying before their eyes. His unconscious words had laid their truth bare, more powerfully than any waking confession ever could. He had not chosen. In the deepest, most honest recesses of his mind, a place stripped bare by fever, they were both there. They were intertwined, inseparable. One was his calm, his safe harbor after the storm. The other was his fire, his wild, untamed passion. He needed the sun and the rain both, and without both, he would be lost. They looked at each other over his still form, and for the first time, there was no jealousy, no rivalry in their gaze. There was only a shared, devastating understanding. They were not two women competing for the love of one man. They were two halves of a heart that he could not bear to live without. Later that night, when his breathing had evened out into a deep, feverish sleep, they sat together at the small table, the lamp casting a small, golden pool of light in the vast darkness. The silence stretched, filled with the sound of crickets and Elijah's ragged breathing. It was Clara who spoke first, her voice a low, weary whisper. "He called for you. He was afraid you would leave him." Violet stared down at her hands, twisting a loose thread on her worn dress. "He called for you, too. He was at peace when he held your hand." Another long silence. Then Violet looked up, her green eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I hate this, Clara," she confessed, her voice thick with a pain that went beyond the current crisis. "I hate feeling like I'm at war with you. You are my sister. You are all I have in this world, and I have been so cruel." "No," Clara said, her own voice breaking. She reached across the table and laid her hand over Violet's restless ones. You have been honest. You have fought for what you want. I am the one who runs. I have always run. I saw the love you had for him, and my first instinct was to leave, to disappear, to make it simple. But it is not simple. When he looks at you, Violet whispered, her gaze distant, it's like the world goes quiet. He looks at you and sees home. And when he looks at you, Clara replied, her voice filled with a quiet wonder, he sees life. He sees a fire that he thought had gone out in him forever. I saw it on his face when you came back from the hills. He was broken and hurt, but he was more alive than I had ever seen him. She squeezed Violet's hands. I was not jealous. Violet, not truly. I was afraid. Afraid that my quiet love was not enough. Afraid that I would lose the only peace I have ever known. And I was afraid, Violet admitted, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek, that my fire would burn him, that it was too much, too selfish, that all I could ever be was a storm he needed to survive, while you were the shelter he needed to live. They looked at each other, their faces illuminated by the single lamp, and in that moment they saw their own pain, their own fear, their own deep and abiding love reflected in the other's eyes. They were not rivals. They were mirror images of the same heart, a heart that had been broken in different ways but had somehow found its way to the same impossible place. They were both in love with the same man, and they both knew, with a certainty that transcended jealousy, that he was just as deeply in love with both of them. "What do we do?" Violet asked, the question a raw, vulnerable plea. Clara's gaze drifted toward the cot where Elijah lay, his life hanging by a thread. "We survive," she said, her voice gaining a strength, a clarity that had not been there before. "Just as he told me we must. We live true." She turned back to Violet, her gray eyes clear and resolute. "We do it together." She held out her other hand. Violet looked at it for a long moment, then slowly, she placed her free hand in Clara's. Their four hands were clasped together on the rough-hewn table, a pact sealed in the dead of night, in a cabin filled with the scent of fever and fear and a love that defied all names. They would not be rivals. They would be partners. They would not be two women. They would be a family, a strange, broken, and beautiful family of three. They would share the burden, and they would share the man. If he lived, for 2 more days, they fought for him. They were a seamless, silent team. They brewed bitter teas from willow bark and herbs they found by the nearly dry creek bed. They never left his side, their combined presence a constant, anchoring force. They worked without rest, fueled by a desperate, shared hope and the strength they now drew from each other. On the morning of the 6th day, the fever broke. It left him as suddenly as it had arrived, his skin finally cool and damp with a clean sweat. His breathing, which had been a ragged, painful rasp, deepened into the slow, steady rhythm of a true and healing sleep. He woke in the late afternoon. The world returned to him slowly, in fragments. The first thing he was aware of was the slant of golden sunlight coming through the window, illuminating the familiar grain of the log walls. The second was a profound, bone-deep weakness. He felt hollowed out, as if he had been running for 100 miles. He turned his head, the simple movement an act of supreme effort, and then he saw them. They were not on opposite sides of the room. They were not watching each other with wary, wounded eyes. They were sitting in 2 chairs, pulled close to his cot, and they were sitting side by side. Violet was asleep, her head resting on Clara's shoulder, her fiery hair a stark contrast to Clara's dark, sober dress. Clara was awake, watching him, and she was holding Violet's hand, their fingers intertwined in her lap. As his eyes fluttered open and focused on her, a slow, gentle smile touched Clara's lips. She did not look surprised or relieved. She simply looked at peace. She squeezed Violet's hand, and the younger woman stirred, lifting her head. Her green eyes, groggy with sleep, found his. The sharp, defiant edges were gone, replaced by a soft, unguarded tenderness. He lay there, stunned into silence, too weak to even form a question. He looked from one face to the other. He saw no rivalry, no anger, no pain. He saw only a unified, unbreakable calm, a shared, gentle strength. He saw two women who had been through the fire and had emerged not as separate, scarred individuals, but as a single, forged entity. He looked at their joined hands, a symbol of a pact he could not possibly comprehend, and as they both looked back at him, their expressions a perfect, mirrored blend of love and quiet resolve. He realized that while he had been lost in the darkness, fighting for his life, they had been fighting a battle of their own. And they had won. The world he had woken up to was not the one he had left. Something fundamental, something irrevocable, had shifted, and he was no longer caught between them. He was simply, miraculously, held by them. The season turned. The brutal, sun-bleached tyranny of summer finally broke, surrendering to the gentle, golden rain of autumn. A deep, healing rain came first, washing the red dust from the air and soaking into the cracked, thirsty earth. Almost overnight, a faint blush of green returned to the plains. The air, once heavy and suffocating, grew crisp and cool, carrying the sharp, clean scent of distant wood smoke and curing grass. It was a season of reprieve, of gathering in, a time when the land itself seemed to take a long, slow, contented breath. Inside the small log cabin, a similar transformation had taken place. The brittle tension that had followed Elijah's recovery had softened, then dissolved, replaced by a new, unspoken harmony. They had survived the drought, survived the fever, survived the violent storms of their own hearts. And in that shared survival, they had forged a new way of being. It was a quiet, intricate dance of three bodies and three souls moving in a space that had once been meant for one. There was a rhythm to their days, a seamless, intuitive flow. Clara's quiet, steady presence was the calm heart of their home, the gentle hand that brought order and comfort to their small world. Violet's fiery, restless energy was the spark, the laughter that chased the shadows from the corners, the fierce, protective spirit that met every hardship with a defiant lift of her chin. And Elijah was the anchor, the strong, silent center around which they both revolved. He was the rock against which their waves, one calm, one tempestuous, could break and find their form. They worked as a single unit. When they repaired the stable roof, Violet would climb the ladder with the agility of a squirrel, while Clara passed up the shingles and Elijah hammered them into place. Their movements so synchronized they seemed to have been practicing for a lifetime. In the evenings, they would sit before the fire, Clara mending, Violet reading aloud from a tattered book of poems she had kept, her voice rising and falling with a dramatic flair that made Elijah hide a smile behind his hand. He would watch them, these two women who had been thrown into his life by a freak storm, and a sense of profound, disbelieving wonder would wash over him. His heart, which had been a barren, fallow field for 4 long years, was now, impossibly, in full and glorious bloom. One afternoon, a rider from Redemption's Folly passed through, his horse kicking up the now damp red dust. He brought news. The town was holding its annual harvest festival, a celebration of a meager but hard-won bounty, a final, joyous gathering before the long, cold fist of winter closed its grip on the plains. There would be games, a town feast, and in the evening, a dance in Miller's barn. When the rider had gone, a silence fell over the three of them. The last time they had gone to town, it had been an exercise in shame and humiliation. The memory of the cold, judgmental stares, the whispered condemnations, was a ghost that still haunted the edges of their peace. Clara was the first to break the silence, her voice carefully neutral. "It would be best if we stayed here. We have enough supplies." It was a statement of practicality, but underneath it lay the deep, instinctual fear of a woman who had already been scarred by public scorn. Violet said nothing, but her hands, which had been shelling beans, stilled in her lap. Her gaze was fixed on the distant, hazy line of the horizon, her jaw set in a familiar, stubborn line. She would not ask to go. She would not expose her longing to another refusal. But the desire was there, a palpable thing, shimmering in the autumn air. It was a desire to be seen, not as a sinner or a stray, but as a woman with a right to stand in the light, to hear music, to feel the simple, uncomplicated joy of a community celebration. Elijah looked from Clara's apprehensive face to Violet's proud, silent one. He thought of the weeks and months they had spent building this life, this strange, beautiful, and fragile thing. They had built it in the shadows, hidden away from the world, but a life lived only in the shadows was not a life at all. It was a prison, no matter how comfortable. His love for these women, this vast, unnameable, tripartite love, was not something to be hidden like a secret shame. It was the truest thing he had ever known. And the truth, he decided, deserved to walk in the sun. "We're going," he said, his voice quiet but infused with a finality that brooked no argument. Clara looked at him, her gray eyes wide with alarm. "Elijah, no, you remember what happened last time? The whispers." "Let them whisper," he said, his gaze meeting hers, calm and steady. "Their words are just wind. They can't hurt us unless we let them. We've hidden long enough. It's time we lived." He then turned his eyes to Violet and saw the sudden, brilliant dawn of hope that broke across her face. It was a sight so beautiful it made his heart ache. The day of the festival, a nervous, electric energy filled the cabin. Clara and Violet brought out 2 simple dresses they had painstakingly sewn from bolts of calico bought on a solitary, swift trip Elijah had made to town. Clara's was the color of a stormy sky, a deep blue gray that matched her eyes and spoke of her quiet, dignified soul. Violet's was the color of autumn leaves, a vibrant calico of gold and russet that mirrored the fire within her. They helped each other braid their hair, their fingers deft and sure, a silent, sisterly ritual of preparation for the battle ahead. Elijah, for his part, took out his straight razor and gave himself the closest, most careful shave he'd had in years. He put on a clean, faded blue shirt, one he hadn't worn since before Sarah and Jacob had passed, and the simple act felt like a resurrection. When he looked at his reflection in the small, cracked piece of mirror he owned, he saw not the lonely, haunted man of a few months ago, but a man who had something profound and precious to fight for. They rode to town not as they had before, with the women hidden away like cargo, but as a statement. Elijah sat in the center of the buckboard's bench, the reins held firmly in his hands. On his right sat Clara, her back ramrod straight, her bonnet perfectly tied. On his left sat Violet, her chin high, her green eyes scanning the horizon. They were a united, defiant front, an unconventional trinity rolling into the heart of convention. As they entered the main street of Redemption's Folly, the reaction was immediate and predictable. A hush fell over the bustling crowds. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned. The whispers began. A rustle of judgment that spread like a grass fire. But this time, something was different. Elijah did not look away. He met every stare, every narrowed, curious glance, with a calm, level gaze of his own. He nodded politely to the men he knew, a simple, non-negotiable acknowledgement of his presence and his right to be there, beside him. Clara did not shrink. She looked straight ahead, her face serene, her hands folded calmly in her lap. She was no longer a woman fleeing from shame. She was a woman anchored by a love that made her impervious to it. And Violet met the stairs with a cool, almost amused look in her eye, as if she were observing the strange customs of a primitive tribe. The anger was gone. replaced by a deep, unshakable confidence. They were not asking for acceptance. They were simply stating their existence. The day passed in a surreal, sun-drenched haze. They moved through the festival as a unit, a small, self-contained island of quiet dignity in a sea of speculation. They watched the horse races. They shared a plate of roasted pork and cornbread at the town feast. They listened to the mayor give a long-winded speech, and through it all, they were aware of the bubble of space around them, of the way people would fall silent as they approached and resume their murmuring as they passed. It was a lonely and liberating experience, to be so thoroughly a part of something, and yet so completely separate. As evening fell, the celebration moved to Miller's barn. The great cavernous space had been swept clean and decorated with strings of glowing paper lanterns. The air was thick with the sweet smell of hay, apple cider, and the rosin from the fiddler's bow. A lively tune struck up, and couples, young and old, swirled across the makeshift dance floor. For a long moment, the three of them stood in the doorway, watching. This was the final test. This was the heart of the community, a place of courtship and family and tradition. To step inside was to step into the full glare of the town's judgment. Elijah took a deep breath. He turned to Clara and held out his hand. "May I have this dance, ma'am?" he asked, his voice low and formal, yet filled with a deep, private tenderness. A faint, beautiful blush rose on Clara's cheeks. She placed her hand in his. "You may, sir." He led her onto the floor, and as they began to move to the rhythm of a slow, sweet waltz, a hush fell over the other dancers. The circle around them widened, the whispers at the edges of the room growing louder. But Elijah and Clara were oblivious. They moved in a world of their own, his hand firm on the small of her back, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. They looked only at each other, and in that shared gaze was a universe of understanding, of shared sorrow and quiet joy. He was dancing with the calm of his soul, and the peace he felt was a shield against the world. When the song ended, he led her back to the edge of the floor and bowed. Then he turned to Violet, whose eyes were shining with a fierce, proud light. "And you, ma'am?" he said, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Violet's grin was dazzling. "I thought you'd never ask." The fiddler, as if sensing a shift in the mood, struck up a lively, foot-stomping reel. He took her hand, and she felt like a bolt of lightning in his arms. They spun and laughed, her russet-colored dress a blur of motion, her feet flying over the wooden floorboards. She was pure, unadulterated life, a whirlwind of joy and defiance. He was dancing with the fire in his heart, and her energy, her sheer, untamed spirit, filled him with a strength he hadn't known he possessed. When that song too came to an end, a slow, melancholic ballad began. Elijah stood between them, breathing heavily, his heart full to bursting. He looked at Clara, his safe harbor, and at Violet, his wild, open sea. And in that moment, he knew he could not, would not, choose between them. He held out his right hand to Clara and his left hand to Violet. They looked at him, then at each other, a silent question passing between them. Then, with a shared, trusting smile, they each placed a hand in his. He led them both onto the floor. He drew Clara close, his right arm around her waist, and kept Violet's hand in his left, holding it against his heart. They moved together, a strange, graceful, three-person waltz. It was awkward at first, then it found its rhythm. They were a single, living entity, swaying to the sad, sweet music, a perfect, impossible triangle of love and acceptance. The whispering stopped. The staring continued. But it was no longer judgmental. It was awestruck. The people of Redemption's Folly, for all their narrow-mindedness, were witnessing something they had never seen before, a truth so honest, so profound, that it defied their simple definitions of right and wrong. Watching from the shadows near a stack of hay bales was a tall, stooped man with a mane of white hair and eyes as clear and blue as a winter sky. It was Reverend Michael, the town's aging pastor. He had known Elijah's father, had, in fact, baptized Elijah as a baby. He watched the strange, beautiful dance, his face not filled with condemnation, but with a deep, thoughtful compassion. When the dance was over and Elijah had led the women to get a cup of cider, the Reverend approached him. "Elijah," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "Reverend," Elijah replied, his body tensing for the sermon he was sure was coming. But the old man simply looked at him, his gaze kind. He glanced over at Clara and Violet, who were chatting quietly a few feet away, their heads close together like the old friends they had become. "Your father was a good man," the Reverend said. "A hard man, but a good one. He believed in the truth of the heart above all else." He put a gentle, gnarled hand on Elijah's shoulder. "The Lord works in ways we are not meant to understand. People will talk. Let them, as long as their hearts are pure," he said, nodding toward the women, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "And there is no deceit or cruelty among them. Who dares forbid love?" He squeezed Elijah's shoulder once, a gesture of benediction, and then turned and walked away, leaving Elijah standing in the warm, lantern-lit air, feeling as though the weight of the world had been lifted from his soul. The journey home was made in a comfortable, triumphant silence beneath a canopy of brilliant stars. They had faced the world, and they had not been broken. The next week, Elijah began to build. He chose a spot on the west side of the cabin where the morning sun would hit, and he felled 2 tall pines. He began to hew the logs, the rhythmic thwack of his axe the only sound in the crisp autumn air. The women helped. They dragged the logs. They mixed the mud and moss for chinking. They held the timbers steady as he notched them into place. They were not just building a room. They were building a tangible symbol of their future, a physical manifestation of their new life. When it was finished, it was a simple, sturdy room, smelling of fresh-cut pine and damp earth. It was large enough for 2 cots, with a small window that looked out over the endless plains. That night, a full, luminous harvest moon hung in the inky black sky, bathing the world in a silvery, ethereal light. The 3 of them stood in the doorway between the old part of the cabin and the new, looking into the space they had built together. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, gentle glow. No words were needed. The time for agonizing, for questioning, for defining, was over. Violet stepped forward first and turned to face them. Then Clara moved to stand beside her. Elijah filled the space in front of them, completing their circle. He reached out, not in passion, but in a gesture of profound, all-encompassing love, and drew them both into his arms. Clara rested her head on his right shoulder, Violet on his left. He held them, one in each arm, their bodies fitting against his as if they had been designed to be there. He felt the soft sigh of Clara's breath, the fierce, steady beat of Violet's heart against his ribs. It was a moment of perfect, sacred stillness. They were not a man and his 2 lovers. They were a family. They were a single, complete soul, finally at peace. They were home. The years that followed were quiet ones. The whispers in town eventually faded, replaced by a grudging, silent acceptance. Life on the ranch continued, marked by the turning of the seasons, by the hardships and the small, simple joys of a life lived true. Sometimes, in the evenings, they would sit together on the porch Elijah had built, watching the sun set over the vast, empty plains. The sky would bleed into impossible shades of orange, and pink, and deep, royal purple. They would sit in a comfortable silence, Clara leaning against his right side, Violet against his left, their hands intertwined. There was no fear in their eyes anymore, no lingering ghosts of the past. There was only the deep, quiet peace of acceptance. They had walked through the fire of judgment and the desolation of their own private griefs, and they had come out the other side, not unscathed, but whole. In a place where prejudice had once been as thick as the red dust, they had found the one thing that could not be divided by three, a heart that beat in unison. Thank you for listening to this story. I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below and let's connect. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to the From Wild West channel and sharing your thoughts. Your support means the world